Hello and welcome to Why Postliberalism Failed. This is episode 3. We're going to spend more time talking to Thomas rather than me talking. And rather than talking about wild conspiracy theories, we'll be talking about headier, more uplifting and theologically interesting debate um, over Catholic theology. I should mention today's July 12th, 2024. Still in the summertime here, very hot in Florida, probably lovely up there in New Jersey. No idea what that's like. I've completely forgotten what ordinary weather is like. There is a not zero chance that at some point in my window over here, you'll see movement. I am not going to be attacked from my window. They're just cleaning the windows. So if you're watching this and you're afraid for my life, I appreciate it, but it is not in danger. It's hard to know where to start on the question of Catholic integralism and Catholic doctrine, but I want to go back to something, Thomas, on from our first episode, which is there a political or social teaching in the Catholic Church that is taught as unreformable dogma?
That's a big question. There are certainly yes, because there are aspects of social teaching that are directly follow from natural law principles, and
Right.
there are aspects of social teaching that directly follow from things that are plausibly fall from revelation, such as the superiority of the spiritual authority over the temporal authority. But there aren't, as far as the natural law ones are concerned, we'll get to that. There's that. So there are certainly natural law constraints on anything that we do with social doctrine.
Right.
And the church understands itself, the Pope understands itself as authoritative in interpretation of the natural law and its principles and norms. There are some constraints on social doctrine that come from revelation, but there aren't very many of them, because there's not a whole lot in Scripture that's unanimous among the fathers as protecting the deposit of faith in apostolic tradition that relates directly to it. There are some things that we're going to talk about, but much of social doctrine goes beyond those two. It is not determined by those two sources, but the church will take on a social doctrine that can apply what we know from those sources.
So is everything
it's going to bring in other stuff though outside of those sources.
Yeah, and the reason why I'm asking you these questions is to kind of lay the groundwork for a few others. Is every statement made by a pope, whether it's an encyclical or if it's a bull, any kinds of sort of papal statements, are these unreformable dogma?
No, not normally. There are irreformable document. There are what we call infallible statements that are made by popes and councils, and the church normally recognizes there's the ones that are given in an extraordinary fashion,
right,
by the Pope, for instance, in which he sets forth as irreformable a certain doctrine, as a sort of perennial principle of that follows from scripture and tradition. Examples of that would be like I'm so sorry.
These are hard questions, Thomas. Hopefully people understand that.
Yeah, that's right. The doctrine of the Immaculate Conception was pronounced that way by the Pope, and so is the doctrine of the Assumption. There are also infallible statements of the Universal Ordinary Church, where the Church in all times and places has taught something, and so we can accept that as being as an infallible truth as well.
So when we look at encyclicals like Duo Sunt, all the way back in what, 494?
Yeah. Although that one wasn't an encyclical, it was a letter to the emperor.
Right, in a letter to the emperor, or if we look at Unum Sanctum, or
Which,
we'll say again.
which was a papal bull.
And when we look at, let's say, Quanta Cura, that's what is.
That's the encyclical.
And let's say we look at Leo the 13th's Immortali Dei.
Yep, that's also an encyclical.
And Libertas.
Yes, Libertas.
So are these statements of what the Catholic Church believes and all Catholics must submit to?
Well, you'd have to look at the individual things that are said within those
right
things. There are some statements, and even in any form, such as papal encyclicals, that could arguably be called either affirming something as part of the universal ordinary magisterium, or as an extraordinary move for the Pope to declare something as being the case. So you'd have to look at the individual statements within.
So, and now here we need to play a little bit of catch up with definitions, as well as clarify something that I've been saying to make sure that I've been using the right term.
Yeah.
The first is I've been saying unreformable. I've heard you say irreformable, which is it either or am I saying the wrong word?
Yeah, I was just using ordinary language.
Okay. And when we say that, what mean that this is what the church teaches and will never not teach, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
And when it comes to
any sort of reform to the doctrine of the Trinity of three persons, one nature.
And when we say ordinary magisterium and there's also extraordinary magisterium, what do these mean?
Ordinary magisterium and extraordinary magisterium. Yeah,
I feel like you're taking your oral comps. This is rough.
Yeah, no, that's right. It's just ordinary magisterium is just ordinary. Sorry, it's almost everything is ordinary magisterium that's said by popes and bishops outside of, but extraordinary magisterium is when they're where the Pope is sort of standing above the fray, or a council is, and they're formally defining something.
So what status does integralism have in the history or the magisterial teaching of the Catholic Church?
Well, that's complex. That's really
right.
complex.
Really complex, and that's where we're going to kind of open this up.
Yeah, exactly. There are some things that it claims that you could say that they're very solidly grounded in revelation or the tradition, but there are other things that are not so much. So,
okay, so we'll get into that complexity now. We'll start with what is integralism? Normally, when we come to that question, it's answered with the integralism in 3 sentences on the Josias, but our friend Kevin Valier has explained that there might be some inadequacies to that definition in the way that contemporary integralists use it. So why don't you give me what you regard as the right kind of definition for it? Are you calling up the 3 sentences now?
Yeah, I'm going to call up the 3 sentences here because this was in Potter Edmund's blog in 2016.
It's at least important to use it just to kind of lay down a marker for where I think a lot of these conversations most recently got started.
Yeah, I'll tell you what it is, and I'll tell you why I don't use it. So,
yeah,
it says Catholic integralism is a tradition of thought that, rejecting the liberal separation of politics from concern with the end of human life, already sort of slanted against a certain interpretation of liberalism, right?
Right.
Holds that political rule must order man to his final goal. Since, however, man has both a temporal and an eternal end, integralism holds that there are 2 powers that rule him, a temporal power and a spiritual power. And since man's temporal end is subordinated to his eternal end, the temporal power must be subordinated to the spiritual power.
Right. That's why my go-to joke when that was more in use was, well, my separation of those 2 powers isn't liberal, so I guess it doesn't apply to me. But the liberals just, they're meant to remind you of liberalism, in their view, teaching this sort of thing. So what's the problem with this definition?
Well, it's not specific enough, but have some value insofar as it gives a normative. It highlights a normative claim that they're making. So I normally define integralism in terms of the Pope's affirming the Pope's indirect power to oblige Catholic leaders to regulate orthodoxy by issuing punishments against heresy and apostasy, right? That really kind of like is what they're trying to defend. But it's more than that, though. That's not doesn't work fully as a definition either, because it's also a claim that even if it's, Maritain would have said maybe sometimes that was justified, but it's not ideal. We don't say it's not ideal. And integralists, almost all of them, or that's really where the big debate comes down is this ideal, and is it any longer justified? Should we be doing it now? And is it ideal? Should we look for it in the future? That the non-integralists all do not want that. And they don't want to say that. Integralists, people call themselves integralists, all seem to think of it as an ideal. Now, this definition of the three sentences at least gets towards that normative second part, that since man's temporal end is subordinated to his eternal end, the temporal power must be subordinated to the spiritual power. But it's also not specific enough. Jacques Maritain spent a good amount of time showing how in the secular age, how in a liberal society, he wouldn't call it liberal society, but like something like a modern society, how the temporal becomes subordinated to the spiritual. And he says the locus of the coordination and integration and subordination of that is the person themselves. That the citizen is also becomes his citizenship becomes incorporated into his own Catholicism. And that's the way that this principle of the superiority of the spiritual, and this principle of the importance that the temporal be directed towards the spiritual becomes analogically applied in our current context, right? So he's responding. So Maritain is very intelligently responding to this criticism that, you can find him below, or how do you pronounce his name? I don't pronounce French.
I say billet because I'm from East Texas and I never say anything right.
No, it's okay. But people like that, or even some elements of Leo the 13th, that people like Maritain will say that you don't necessarily need a Catholic state that has integrated itself and subordinated itself to the hierarchical Catholic Church and the papacy.
Well, this is why I asked you earlier about the status of these papal statements, because what you'll often hear is, but that's not what Leo the 13th said, so why didn't Maritain get in line?
Yeah.
So is Maritain is he like a bad Catholic?
Well, no, I mean, Maritain is trying to intelligently understand these principles in light of their context that they were issued, and then the context that we're in right now. And if you look at, for instance, Leo the 13th's Immortale Dei, which is one of those encyclicals that the integralists will appeal to, he talks about the public profession of faith, and he gives an argument that natural law can confirm that just as individuals have a duty to seek out the truth and conform themselves to it, and to seek out the true religion and conform themselves to it, so do then the society, because that's just a bunch of individuals that they also do. But there's some ambiguity in his treatment between what society is, societas, and the other words that he uses, civil community. There's some ambiguity there. Does that mean what used to get called the body politic? You ever heard that expression, the body politic?
Yeah.
The political community? Because if you go back further in tradition, before these sort of 19th century reactions, right? If you go back further in the tradition, you find people like Suarez, and you find people like what's his name?
Vittoria.
Vittoria and the Spanish Scholastics. If you go back to them, the way they talk, they're clear to distinguish between the body politic and its governing part, the leader. Normally, it was a sovereign or prince, right? Because that's the regime they were in. But Maritain is right to take from that tradition this recognition that there's a difference between the political community, the people that come together for the sake of the common, underneath leadership for the sake of the common good. It's those people coming together, the political community. The governing part, the sovereign or the prince, or now we would say the state, is just one part of the political community. It's the governing, right? So everything that the argument that Leo XIII made, if you distinguish those two things, it really only makes sense of the political community itself, right? That if you have these individuals that have this duty towards the truth and that to affirm the truth if they find it, so does the political community. But that doesn't mean that that part of the political community called the government is the part has some sort of duty itself to proclaim the true religion. Maybe it just maybe for prudential reasons they decide to stay out of it.
So we have
or to just not make that part of what the government does.
So we have two things that we've distinguished here. The first is that there is a dispute over the nature of government, one in which the government is entirely understood as the state, and the people operating within that state are primarily required to obey that state. And the other view to that is that there are components to the state in which you have the government and then you have the people. And this older tradition you mentioned, the people are actually prior to the state, and where the state fails or the government rather, and where the government fails to meet its designed ends, the people can actually consider this. Like the early Thomas Aquinas thought it was possible to overthrow tyrants. It gets more complicated after that. Bellarmine, of course, thinks this is possible because one of the things he's kind of hoping for is the recusants will get rid of Elizabeth I. I think it's a little too late for that, but some sort of Protestant can get removed. So that's the first two questions, right? Or the first two positions on one question. And the second question is the degree to which one can disagree over this, given the statements made by authorities in the church, especially the Pope.
Yeah.
And the reason why I want to talk about these two things together is because first you did, and second of all, this plays really important role in the debate we have over integralism. Because what we're going to do is we're going to get to that question, those two questions in Dignitatis Humanae. And I don't know how many minutes we are in, but we got there, right? We got to this issue that's at the heart of this chapter you're writing for our book, which is Dignitatis Humanae. It's a statement about religious liberty, and it is in some sense very different from statements made immediately prior, especially during the 19th century. But as you know, as late Pope Benedict XVI pointed out, is actually more aligned with older statements. And so this is the idea of the hermeneutic of reform. So take from that those observations what you want to get us into a discussion of Dignitatis Humanae.
Yeah. So if you read, if those who are listening, if you read Dignitatis Humanae is like huge, one of the most important documents in the history of the church. Dignitatis Humanae comes in the Second Vatican Council. It's a well-written document, I think, and it's very unambiguously clear that it affirms and makes its own a doctrine of religious liberty, that the civil authority is to protect the religious liberty of its citizens, irrespective of their religion. And this is only to be limited by the demands of public order, right? It's not to be limited because of whether it meets the person's religious practice meets the standards of orthodoxy, right? So that's what Dignitatis Humanae says. And Dignitatis Humanae is huge, right? Because after the sort of revolutions of America and France at the end of the 18th century, the church itself, especially the church leadership in continental Europe, immediately, or not immediately, especially after the second phase of the French Revolution. Remember, the first phase of the French Revolution wasn't all that bad, right? It was They were demanding equal representation in the National Assembly. They didn't even want to allow the head of the king. They were happy to keep the king, right? And then you get to the second phase, and you get the Jacobin terror and all of that.
And don't forget about the civil constitution of the clergy, and
Yeah.
that really divided the church and caused a bunch of problems. But that is a problem that you can deal with. Mass slaughter of religious people, not the same.
Yeah, that's right. So what happened in the second phase of the radicalism of the second phase of the French Revolution leads to this huge counter reaction on the part of the Catholics and the Catholic leaders, where they find themselves surrounded and threatened by these new revolutionary movements, and they're trying to make sense of it. And if you look back, and there's just, I mean, they're bad. There's bad done on both sides. There's bad done on both sides. This back and forth.
Plenty of bad people on both sides, to coin a phrase.
plenty of bad people on both sides, right? And but they're also, you can also understand somewhat of the reaction, because they've seen this thing pan out. It has tyrannical elements in the second phase that want to not just leave religion alone, but to control it. There's all these things going on, and
the slaughter at Vendée, you have the profaning of the
Vendée, that's right, and the all of these things, right?
The profaning of the cathedral. They take a prostitute and she dances on the altar to the Temple of Reason.
Exactly.
Frowned on. Exactly. That was a frowned on moment. The Catholic Church.
It was a very different setting than the American Catholic Church the American Catholic Church, where there was certainly persecution, right? But it was much more subtle, and but overall, the Catholics came to appreciate the way that the government handled things in the United States, even though there was some Catholic persecution through the 19th century.
It's almost too much to call it persecution. It's more like discrimination.
Discrimination.
At no point is a Presbyterian mob showing up at St. Patrick's and, I don't know, dancing a Calvinist pastor on the altar. They just don't give the Catholics the money they need to build their schools.
And those who had any experience of other kinds of persecution, where it probably felt like it was nothing, considering it was a mostly Protestant country, they're like, wow, comparatively speaking.
They're not seizing church property and turning it over to the state. That's normally the experience Catholics have.
Yeah, exactly. So the Americans have a very different experience than the French and the Italians. But because of this really hardcore scenario in France and Italy in the 19th century, the popes find themselves siding with some pretty reactionary people.
Suddenly, this view of there being civil society or the people and the government, they don't want to talk about it in those terms, because those are what the revolutionaries are arguing.
That's right.
And when the revolutionaries argue that position, they argue it without the church's appeal to there being a moral law that the people themselves and the government must rely on, and that the church provides instruction in. Instead, the radicals believe that the people can do as they please. Right? This is that's right. A big problem. That's part of what's informing things like Quanta Cura.
That's right. So you get was it Gregory? What's his name?
Is it the 16th?
Gregory the 16th, right? In 1832.
Yeah.
He writes an encyclical on liberalism and religious indifferentism. It's called Mirari Vos.
Right. That's the one I was thinking of.
If you read that one, it's very clear that the issue of liberalism is undividable from the standpoint of Gregory the 16th from the issue of indifferentism, because that's the way that their opponents were arguing it, right? That there is no religious truth, right? So people should just be able to, do what they want. There's some very dubious claims made in this encyclical that are not based on revelation or natural law, but empirical claims that are just empirically very dubious, and we can dismiss those fairly easily. And you have to remember too, the further you get from the revolution, the more people adopt a sort of romantic view of what was like before the French Revolution as well.
Yes, that is an extremely important point.
Yeah, and they also have very little historical sense of the way that state religions in the early modern period were not what Christendom was in the Middle Ages. They were a completely different thing. They just seemed like their golden age was just before the revolution, and then they took it from us. And we talked about last time who took that from them. That was another issue.
The idea of the confessional state is a modern concept because it incorporates the idea of the modern state. And the older view, what you had were people that were responsible for certain amounts of land and had due title to that land. So it was indistinguishable from a king or a duke, or often you had bishops or abbots that ran territories that they be Catholic, obviously Catholic in the case of the abbots. And bishops, and the idea is that their personal faith played a role in their ruling of those territories. And the state, you have an abstraction of personal rule of the person in charge allocated to some kind of institution like a bureaucracy or a parliament. And so the idea of a confessional state only comes after we have the idea of a state separate from that personal rule. I'm sorry to be constantly throwing in these parentheticals, and believe me, we're going to get to integralism in a second. But for us to get to integralism requires us more than 3 sentences.
Yeah, that's right. And so what they don't realize too is that during this whole time of the sort of what Maritain calls the Baroque age, this time of the state religions, a lot of times it was really bad for the church because the state had so much power. They would it would influence the church. It was more like the state using the church as an arm of the state than the other way around.
The period of the confessional state was Gallicanism, in which the French monarchy had more control over the appointment of bishops than the church herself.
That's right. And that's why the church was so like when the Pope sent people to talk to George Washington at the end of the 18th century, and they said, you can appoint whatever bishops you want. We don't care.
Right? It's none of our business.
They were like, whoa, this is awesome.
That's one of my favorite John Courtney Murray stories.
Huh?
I said that's one of my favorite stories I got from Father John Courtney Murray.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, that's where I read that one. Yeah, it's like the Libertas Ecclesia, right, is finally in the back, and it's in the United States, and the person who negotiates that position is Benjamin Franklin, known Freemason.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's like, I mean, because they didn't have that freedom in Catholic countries even.
No.
So then you get to Pius IX, who is very much threatened by all these forces of sort of liberalizing forces. You're
literally
it's around
right, like the Kingdom of Italy, right?
Yeah, the Kingdom of Italy. That's right.
Yeah, they are in the middle of a war.
Yeah,
that's right. In charge,
and they're going to take the Papal States. So his reaction is somewhat, understandable. We can go back and critique some of his decisions, but it should be understood at least in its context. So then Pius IX also tries to keep Catholics from participating in these new regimes at all, right? Which only makes the problem worse because then they don't have any say in how that they're going to be run.
Yeah. That makes it even more anti-clerical because there's no one organizing and voting.
That's right. So you get to Leo XIII and he sees this problem, so then he allows the Catholics to start participating in these regimes.
Right.
But as this all is happening, and the Catholics are taking the sides with what they think as their friends because they're the ones that aren't anti-clerical. A lot of the people they're taking sides with are these pretty reactionary figures who are in. There's so many conspiracy theories about the Jews and the Masons that are trying to destroy us. They just start to adopt this rhetoric of what their doctrine that they're trying to push on us is diabolical. Look what they took from us. We need to restore the throne and altar. It gets worse and worse and worse. And then you have the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a fake document made by some very malicious figure. We know not who.
It's probably Russian secret police, but we don't know who wrote it in their office.
Yeah, that's right.
Imagine being assigned to write this. It's like you're just sitting there, you go to work one day, it's like, we need you to write something about the Jews.
Yeah, no, it's awful. And so you have that, and then you have the Dreyfus affair in France
Right.
at the end of the 19th century, and anti-Semitism is just picking up like crazy. And then we see what happens. We talked about last time what happened with Franco in Spain, with the Nazis in Germany, who were influenced by this reactionary, religious reactionary throne and altar.
Yeah, they essentially add a weird kind of biological component to this political and spiritual conspiracy theory.
That's right.
But it seems like
and then they turn on the Catholics by saying that the Catholics are they're just spiritual Jews. So like now they're the problem too. So
right, liberal Catholics are, and incredibly we've been accused of this. So this stuff's still around. But so all of this background. What does this have to do with integralism? This seems to actually have a lot to do with integralism from our point of view, but a lot of people who've been following this primarily from like a theological text approach, they don't know this stuff.
So that's
what does this actually matter?
Well, it matters. I mean, Jacques Maritain realized it mattered. He is married to a Jewish woman, and he knew a lot of Jewish people, a lot of Jewish friends, and he realized that this was becoming a very big problem and that something needs to be done about it. He was originally in Action Francais, but then he got out of it. Pope said he had to get out of it, and that got him starting to rethink the way he would rethink things. And it leads to this progressive movement for him towards him and people like Yves Simon opposed this. They realized this is brutal. What this is, this fascism, all of this stuff, this is bad stuff. So we need to find a way, from a Catholic perspective, how to respond to this, because something has gone deeply wrong. So these people are very big minds that are breaking through the zeitgeist that they're surrounded in. That's them and some of the other farmers. They're seeing this as a problem. And then we see what happens with the Holocaust, World War II and the Holocaust. And how could you not rethink things after what happened with the Holocaust? I mean, now Maritain was ahead of the game. He was getting critiqued by high officials of the Francoist regime, like they hated him. Because he was
Julio Mindville in Argentina, a known anti-Semite, was going for him.
That's right. And this was in the early 30s. So it wasn't just 1945. He was jumping at this. He saw the problem. And there were other people like Dietrich von Hildebrand in Germany, who was a devout Catholic, who saw through all this stuff. And he was wanted by Hitler. He had to escape Germany. He escaped Germany the day the Gestapo showed up at his house.
Oh, I did not know that. That's crazy.
So you had all these people. Somehow we had to break through from the sort of continental reactionary tradition and rethink the relationship to modernity on the issue of religious freedom. And remember, throughout this whole reactionary period, the desire to move back to throne and altar was inseparable from the critique of Jewish emancipation. If you read the Jesuits' top journal in 1890, they came out with an article on the Jewish question.
La Civiltà Cattolica? I don't know Italian. It's in 1890 they published them.
Yeah, it's in Rome, and their thesis is that we need to reverse emancipation. And sorry, that we have to, because of what the damage they're doing to Catholic countries.
As 90 years later, too, they're still complaining about it.
Yeah, exactly.
Emancipation, I should say 90 years after French emancipation, there were other states that were very slow.
Yeah. Well, we see that Spain didn't have full emancipation until 1978.
Yeah. Who died soon before that?
What's that?
Who's the guy who died
Franco
only
died
a few years
4 years before that?
Yeah.
Franco, he was a true believer in all that stuff.
Yeah, he died in 75. So, they restore the monarchy. And what does the monarchy do? Gives them liberal democracy and free Jews.
Yeah.
So in the end, the throne and altar come back and they're like, so we don't believe any of this. We're going to do normal politics. Thank you.
So that's a historical background, because that always gets left out, and it's important. So we have a Dignitatis Humanae, people, the champions like Jacques Maritain and John Courtney Murray. They win. I don't care what anyone says, they won. They got what they wanted. I know that John Courtney Murray, he left the council after being the main editor of the third revision of what became Dignitatis Humanae, and there was a bunch added after, but people exaggerate what the import of that. He got what he wanted.
The thing about the back and forth about Murray is just give this like 3 minutes, right? Like, because early on, Americans were proud of Murray, both because he was an American influencing Vatican affairs and because the way that he was influencing them really seemed to speak to the American Catholic experience. And then all of the people who don't like this use that as a way of discrediting Murray, and they point to Cardinal Ottaviani, who had suppressed him from writing in the 1950s. And this is supposed like Dignitatis Humanae becomes an example that Ottaviani was right and the church had capitulated to liberalism.
Yeah. And I mean, and they also like take advantage of the fact that Time magazine put out a thing on John Courtney Murray, and they thought there was evidence that they were funded by the CIA. And it's like, I mean, I could say a billion things, and then one time the CIA picks me up and says, hey, he's right. Like, that doesn't mean that I'm not, what I said before wasn't legitimate.
Well, the CIA at the same time was also, orchestrating things like the Bay of Pigs. And so I don't think their operations were doing that well. But when it comes, the other reason why people get mad about Murray is because the Kennedy campaign and administration are kind of like, hey, we're going to sign on to what Murray's doing. But Murray didn't want that. He wasn't really interested in any of that. But he couldn't control Ted Sorensen and the people over in the Kennedy world. So that's the other thing that he gets tagged with too, is that he's part of this post-Vatican liberalism that introduces clown masses and heterodoxy.
Yeah. So that's the background. So Dignitatis Humanae says all these things about the importance of the civil power of guaranteeing religious freedom, and they says that the basis for this is the dignity of the human person, and that it says the truth. Let's see. Let's go to Dignitatis 1. Let's see here. The Vatican Council professes its belief that it is upon the human conscience that these obligations of religion fall and exert their binding force. The truth cannot impose itself except by virtue of its own truth, as it makes its entrance into the mind at once quietly and with power, and so on and so forth. So if we go back to Quanta Cura, we go back to Mariah Bose, we go back to I think that Leo the 13th is more of a hybrid figure. He's more of a figure who's leading towards a sort of reform away from what's happening with the Pius IX and Gregory the 16th. But the integralists like to point to him as a full-on integralist. I just stay out of that for now. So if you go back to Quanta Cura, there's some statements in there that sound awfully like the Pope is putting a definitive statement that we cannot affirm the liberal doctrine about the religious freedom, right? I can read one of these statements. And that creates a problem for people trying to make sense of the consistency between these, or Catholic doctrine, or the doctrine of these popes in the 19th century in the Second Vatican Council. So you may find this quote from Quanta Cura. So one of the statements that Quanta Cura opposes. Now we can there's a thing called the syllabus of errors, but we can just like ignore that because it was just sort of tacked on to Quanta Cura, and it was
unsigned. It was unsigned.
It was unsigned, and it was basically just sort of a, hey, consult these sources, and showing times that popes had said things related to freedom, right?
Right.
So you don't have, nobody really treats that as any real issue. The real issue is what's actually said in Quanta Cura.
Exactly.
Now, one of the statements that Quanta Cura condemns goes like this. It says, against doctrine of Scripture, of the Church, and of the Holy Fathers, that is the best condition of civil society in which no duty is recognized as attached to the civil power of restraining by enacted penalties offenders against the Catholic religion, except so far as public peace may require. So it sounds like condemning to call it the best condition to not have an integralist regime, right? And on top of that, it says later, now there's some other thing about freedom of conscience that it condemns, but it's so qualified as to make it, it says something about absolute freedom, whether civil or ecclesiastical. Basically, there's no real issue there because it qualifies itself out of being an issue. But later in the Quanta Cura, he says, by our apostolic authority, we reprobate, proscribe, and condemn all the singular and evil opinions and doctrines severally mentioned in this letter, including that one that we just mentioned. And will and command that they be thoroughly held by the children of the Catholic Church as reprobated, proscribed, and condemned. Yikes, okay. This becomes an issue, right? Because this does sound like he's defining something. He's defining a doctrine as being to be held by all, basically. And there's a debate regarding the form that these statements take. There's a interesting debate between, let me find their names.
Journay?
Robert T. Miller, who wrote at Public Discourse a couple articles last few years. And
you meant debate over Dignitatis Humanae, not during.
No, a debate over these statements of Quanta Cura are infallible.
Right? Oh, my mistake. Yeah, the Miller essays are amazing.
And then John P. Joy has the counterpoint. They are infallible statements, and he does it in his blog, the Dialogos Institute blog. Okay. In our book, I stay out of that debate because it's just dealing with the form of the statements, and I go the Benedict XVI route and focus on the matter of the statements, right?
Yeah.
Pink's interpretation is he takes it that these are infallible statements, and he takes it that and beyond this, he takes it that it is an ideal of the church that we have an integralist regime in which the state is subordinated officially to the church's power and operates as a vessel for the church to punish its own members for heresy and apostasy, right? Okay, he takes it like that is the official church still, even after Dignitatis Humanae. And he also, but in his defense, right, Pink does not think that this says anything about what would constitute a just instantiation of this power. He is critical of things done in the past by the church that he thinks were extreme, burning of heretics. And this doesn't have to do directly with indirect power, but this custom of forcing the Jewish people to wear certain clothing, he thinks is unjust and was regrettable. He's more concerned with defending the principle, so that maybe something like monetary penalties by the state acting on behalf of the church for apostasy or heresy would be acceptable, right? So I just want to be clear that he tries to minimalize the actual effect of integralism while still affirming integralism as the ideal, because he does recognize that some of the stuff is unjust. He even says that it would be unjust to exercise this power with Protestants because they're most likely not culpable for not recognizing the Pope's authority. I don't think Pink has any desire to reverse Jewish emancipation or
oh gosh, no.
He's really just trying to defend the principle while minimizing it in practice, right? And that's really what where Pink is coming from. He wants nothing to do with these other reactionary thinkers that we've talked about.
Yeah, in fact, the association with the reactionary thinkers and the sort of decreasing size of those people from the Second Vatican Council to the present is partly what enables Pink to make these arguments again, because so many of the crazies aren't around anymore.
Yeah.
He wants to revisit this question because now it's a theological question rather than burdened by these Looney Tunes. And unfortunately, they're back. No, they're not. They're not as bad as it sounds. But this question really has not really ever been fully resolved, right? We have the schismatic organization or quasi-schismatic organization, Society of St. Pius X, Archbishop Lefebvre, who is unfortunately sort of has a lot of people that have those old views we talked about.
Yeah.
But there are other people who have always found Dignitatis Humanae just too far of a leap from where the church was in the 19th century. And isn't there language in Dignitatis Humanae that says that they're not overruling things they had said before?
Okay, so
This
this
is
gets
something
taken out
that
of
Pink really points out a lot.
yeah, this is something that integralists take out of context frequently.
I've been
Um,
looking this whole time for it and I can't find it. And I know I feel like I'm
yeah,
taking crazy
it's in
pills.
Dignitatis Humanae 1.
One.
Um,
Oh, I was too far down.
okay, so normally the way in everything I've read by integralists, they take this quote, right? They say
Yeah.
the it says, quote, it leaves untouched traditional Catholic, whatever this doctrine of the Vatican Council, right? Leaves untouched traditional Catholic doctrine on the moral duty of men and societies toward the true religion and toward the Church of Christ. But you have to read the whole thing because to have the context. It says religious freedom in turn, which men demand as necessary to fulfill their duty to worship God, to fulfill their duty in any religion. It has to do with immunity from coercion in civil society. Therefore, it leaves untouched traditional doctrines on the moral duty of men and societies towards true religion. So it whatever it leaves untouched cannot be that we're the religious freedom and the coercion thing. It has to be this moral duties of people towards the true religion and the society.
And so go ahead.
And in the previous paragraph, it talks about duties of men. It says all men are bound to seek the truth, especially in what concerns God and his church, and to embrace the truth they come to know and hold fast to it. That's like duties of men, right there. Now, as regards duties of men in society, Martin Rhonheimer points out that the Catechism of the Catholic Church actually references the same line, and it offers a sort of interpretation of it. In the Catechism of the Catholic Church, 1205. Let me pull up Catholic Church. No, not 1205. I gotta find it. Anyways,
oh no.
Catechism of the Catholic Church, 2105.
2105. For those
Catechism
following at home.
2105. You open up your catechism. It references the same citation from Dignitatis Humanae. It said the duty of offering God genuine worship concerns man both individually and socially. This is the traditional Catholic teaching on the moral duty of individuals and societies toward the true religion and the one Church of Christ. That's a quote from Dignitatis Humanae, which the integralists like to use. He said, by constantly evangelizing men, the church works towards enabling them to infuse the Christian spirit into the mentality and mores, laws, and structures of the communities in which they live. The social duty of Christians is to respect and awaken in each man the love of the true and the good. It requires them to make known the worship of the one true religion which exists in the Catholic and Apostolic Church. Christians are called to be the light of the world. Thus, the church shows forth the kingdom of Christ over all creation, in particular over human societies. It's going back to, instead of like this institutional papacy having this sort of institutional relationship with the state, it's going back to this more like early church fathers sort of understanding of the Christians themselves animating society.
Right.
So
Christians within the Roman Empire prior to its
exactly.
conversion.
So that notion of like the ideal of not just individuals but a whole society becoming Catholic is society at the level of sort of the political community, the body, whatever, but not that doesn't necessarily mean any relationship with the government itself.
And the text of Dignitatis Humanae grounds these, quote, inviolable rights of the human person in human dignity, which means that arguing against this position is either to deny dignity of the person or deny that the dignity requires religious liberty. Is that what the church taught before in the 19th century?
Okay, so this one is complex, and this is a big part of the debate between
Rhonheimer. I know. I'm like trying to like just go right into it because for those of you who haven't seen it, by the way, after you finish watching this, go watch the argument between Rhonheimer and Pink at the De Nicola Center a few years ago, and you'll understand a lot of what we're getting into here, because Rhonheimer makes this very point in the debate. I'm totally stealing it.
Okay, so note that the limitations of religious freedom in Dignitatis Humanae, it says, except what's necessary for public order, right? So there's a way that still respects human dignity for there to be indirect burdens on religious freedom. Like if, for instance, you see that in the jurisprudence of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, or before Smith, the way that there was like a 20-year period in which they applied called the Sherbert, what's it called? Anyways, the idea was that if the government was burdening your religion, it had to do so for what they called like a compelling state reason, and it had to be proportionate. It had to be sorry, I got to find the Sherbert test. Let me find that. Just Google the Sherbert test here. I know it's really okay. So the first prong. Oh my. Okay, the first. There's no alternative way of doing it without infringing, right? So it's narrowly tailored, right? Mm-hmm. So that's kind of following the logic of like double effect, right? That if you're going to indirectly allow some bad thing to happen, right, it has to be for a proportionate reason, and it has to be specifically important that you do it that way in order to achieve that proportionate reason, right? So there's a sort of mirrors the sort of logic of indirect burdens on somebody's rights, right? Well, what you consider like a justified indirect burden on somebody's rights of conscience, right, will differ depending on your theory of the state, right? Because if your theory of the state and its competence differs, it's going to affect what you see as the burden, right? If you think it's a compelling state interest to preserve public orthodoxy because that will preserve public peace and order, or because it won't, promote indifference actively, or because, all these other reasons, right? All these other legitimate state reasons, that's going to affect your assessment of how much this indirect burden is respecting the human dignity of the people that you're burdening, right? So what mediates to allow us to say that we adopt this doctrine of the state, Dignitatis Humanae, which is a very modern doctrine, a very American liberal doctrine, American modern doctrine on religious freedom, which Benedict XVI says when he talks to the Curia in 2005 on Christmas, is recovering the patrimony of the church by making this doctrine its own. You're affirming a theory of the state, right, that can now be applied given what we know now. And the reason we're going to apply it now, given what we know now, is because we're concerned with human dignity. That if we stick with the old theory of the state, we're actually going to infringe on human dignity, right? We applied that theory of the state before when we had different awareness of possibilities, right? Because there's a thing that comes up in Benedict's writings and even on Jesus of Nazareth. I've got quotes where he talks about how social doctrine has to constantly change to keep up with our knowledge of possibilities. And so that we can be respectful of human dignity is one of the things he actually says in there, right? If you're coming from the standpoint of Bellarmine in like the 1500s, when you read Bellarmine's defense of an integralist regime against those who are calling for religious freedom, he says, first of all, like, well, who can deny that the heretics are impious, right? He's assuming that they're guilty. And for us, we don't assume that because that seems pretty dubious to us that they're all guilty, right? We now have all these Protestant friends. We even have like lapsed Catholic friends that we can't assume that they're just guilty of like not knowing.
Because they haven't gone and ransacked the Catholic Church, right? Like, or appropriated church property and distributed it to their cronies.
Which is what they were responding to. And then one of those other arguments is this is also important for civic peace that we do it this way, because we have a common faith, we have a common, it brings people together within our regime. And now we know that if anything, religious freedom only promotes peace even more and order even more, right? They've done research, they've done studies on this. I got to find the book here. They've done studies on this. It's like clear as day that there's more violence and political instability when there's lack of religious freedom. But they didn't know that. It seemed plausible. You know who else thought that was plausible? Not only Thomas Hobbes thought that was plausible, right? John Locke thought that. He thought, well, we need
dun, dun.
Yeah, Thomas Hooker thought it. Oh, no, not Thomas Hooker. Richard Hooker thought it. Not Thomas Hooker was in America. And early John Locke thought it until he went to Germany and he saw these people like in this one area of Germany where these people of different confessions were getting along fine. And then he changed his mind on it. He had teachers at Oxford that were promoting religious freedom, and John Locke said, no, we need civic order and peace. And later, John Locke abandoned that with a letter on toleration. And then he's got other letters on toleration, which are actually a little more friendly to Catholics than the one that's famous.
Yeah.
But so that was so you can understand from the horizon, that was justifiable, like their horizon of possibilities. But that's just no longer, it's just dubious. And we also can recognize that doing this for the sake of human dignity and because of the nature of religious truth itself is a perfectly legitimate reason to do it, not for the sake of indifference, which was what Gregory XVI and Pius IX were opposing. They thought it was intimately wrapped up in indifference. So what Benedict XVI says, is they were in a very contingent context, addressing a very contingent matter, and they made a determination based in that contingent matter that is itself contingent. It's contingent upon the reason that they were saying it. And the reason they were saying it was because they were concerned with the religious indifference of those who were promoting these policies.
Doesn't this get us to the issue with Pink, though, who says that Dignitatis Humanae just amounts to a change in church policy given the circumstances, and since circumstances are always changing, we'll end up going back to the 19th century whenever we can?
Not really, though, because it's actually positively affirming this new doctrine of the state. It's based on sources that are not just outside revelation and natural law, but it's empirical sources, political philosophy, all of the stuff are coming in to play now for the church to develop its social doctrine of the state. Now, but it's affirming that positively. This is, they're saying, a better social doctrine that they're positively affirming. Now, it's not infallibly affirmed because it's not something that comes directly from revelation or from natural law, but we can agree with it that it was a very wise thing to affirm, as far as like as necessary in order to respect human dignity. Now, there is asymmetry there too. Now, Maritain has a good point about how there is no like trans-historical ideal for a state, right? Because what's ideal for a state depends on the social context in which the state finds itself, right? We saw that in the Iraq War, right, where people were like, can you impose a sort of liberal democracy on a culture that can't accept it, right? And that is a real problem, right, with trying to impose liberal democracy on a culture that's not ready for it. So that's a point there about you have to distinguish between the political arrangement that Maritain makes in the social context in which it's situated, right? But here's the thing about integralism. If it ever was ideal, I don't know, for any social context, it might have been. I just don't know enough about the social context. You know what I mean? To be able to say with what was politically possible at the time. But even if it was politically possible in the abstract, it might not have been possible in the sense of like from the standpoint of the people there and the possibilities that they were aware of when they were making the decisions, right? But there's a asymmetry there, right? We have all this experience with liberal democracy. We can't just go back now. We can't just be like, oh, we need this other thing that has fallen apart, is completely unstable, and to transition to it would lead to all these injustices, as Kevin Vallier shows. We can't just say like, we need this for any of these real legitimate ends, right? Like common goods that we have in society, right? And if it is the case, as Kevin shows, that even trying to transition to it leads to injustice, and if you get to it, it's going to be very unstable in any modern context with modern technology, modern social organization, modern mass literacy, modern all these things that these conditions that we have in the modern world, it's highly dubious that it would be stable in any of them, right? And knowing what we know now, there makes no sense to try to go back to it or to, right, whatever. So it's not just a policy, temporary policy thing from the Vatican, hoping for a day when we have 100% Catholic countries so we can go back to the ideal, right? No, that is not an ideal, and it won't be an ideal in any of those modern contexts. And we shouldn't even try to go back to it. We can affirm the superiority of the spiritual over the temporal, and that can be integrated and subordinated in persons themselves who are living in these countries. In their churches and all of that. We just don't need to go back to that. And none of that even has to do with the question of not to confuse things. That doesn't have anything to do with the question of establishment, right? This is dealing with like the real thick, like coercive element of integralism, right? Whatever. Establishment, most non-integralists just don't even care. It's just like establishment's like a prudential thing, right? It's like it's prudent to keep it in England probably, but it's not. You know what I mean? Not England.
Trump,
I mean,
yeah. Confessional and an established church are different, and the difference can seem subtle, but the consequences are pretty significant. Confessional state means that the church has this indirect authority for the state to operate on the public in order to permit. In order to empower the state to enforce terms the church requires.
And that's an integralist state, right?
Yeah. And so what you end up with is bishops' prisons. You end up with, dissenting believers taxed to pay for churches they don't believe in. And you have and of course you have under a lot of these states, you have the expulsion or the ghettoization of Jews because they're unbaptized. And an established church means that the church receives a certain amount of public money in order to continue operation and for the training of clergy. And we never really had confessional states in the state level in the United States, but we did have established churches until 1833.
Okay.
Yeah, and so what's funny is that it was the Unitarians who got rid of it in Massachusetts. The Unitarians took over a lot of the positions at Harvard, and all the old Congregationalists didn't want them to get money, so they tossed them out. And some of the Congregationalists were mad because they were hoping to get back in there and get the state to pay their salaries. But
I'm of the opinion that there's a sort of extra legal social contract norm that prevents us from going back to state establishments in the United States. But
the 14th Amendment made it hard, especially the way it's been interpreted with establishment clauses. Although this is always in flux, we've had a few significant court reversals of 20th century jurisprudence that was pretty secularizing, but that's a different podcast.
Yeah, but I don't want establishment churches in the United States.
You don't?
No, I just don't think it's very prudent at all.
The first one you'd get in this country would be the Mormons in Utah. So,
yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
You wouldn't even get Catholics.
Yeah, and it would be pretty alienating, I think, for like the non-Mormons in Utah for them to do that.
It would be the only way you could stop them is to institutionalize the Mormon Church in Utah, and now more rather than de facto where it is now, but de jure. I think that would be like not the straw that broke the camel's back. It would be the cement truck that broke the camel's back, because the experience that we have is that if you look at established churches, let's go through the list. The Church of England, Lutheran Church of Norway, Lutheran Church of Sweden. These are not robust established churches. These are primarily effectively dead churches. If you want to see like Anglicanism thriving, go to Kenya. Like it's not, you don't go to Swinburne.
So basically then the way the old political theology of integralism worked was that you'd have this Catholic leader who was baptized, and as baptized Catholics we have some duty the Pope has some authority to us when he calls on us to help aid the church's mission. And this would be a case of having just a Catholic who's a leader aid the mission. Now, there are natural law restraints, even within integralism, and Thomas Pink will recognize this. There are natural law constraints on how it's applied. Like you said, it wouldn't be appropriate to apply it to Protestants because they aren't plausibly culpable for not recognizing the Pope's authority. But also within a regime, right? There's a sort of constitutional order because, like those people, like I said, like Suarez and Bellarmine, they recognize sort of like there's a social pact that emerges from a society, right? And in these monarchies, these monarchs had like all this discretion. The Pope can just say, "Hey, do this, do that," right? But like if you had like a Catholic president or whatever, he would have no duty whatsoever to listen to the Pope to have him do things that are outside of his own authority, because that would be an act of injustice against the political community. But to do so, because that's not his authority that he's been given from the political community. So there are all these natural law constraints that even like Pink will recognize on it, right? So by recognizing that old doctrine of the state is now morally implausible, right?
Yeah.
With the new doctrine of the state, then you can't really oblige any of these leaders to do any of these things, right? Because it would be asking them to commit injustices and so there's just no obligation there anymore. So even if Pink was right, that these like hardcore integralists, they don't get anything because they need the Pope on their side and they need the political community on their side, and they have neither, right? So they should, according to Pink, they should listen to Dignitatis Humanae and follow it to the T until the Pope says differently in their political community becomes one, like a Catholic state like this. But they should be working towards it. So it should be like a dead end for them, even if they accept Pink. But then I'd say that they shouldn't accept Pink. It's no longer an ideal. It never was an ideal. It was a faulty doctrine of the state based on the knowledge that they had at the time of political possibilities. And now we've got a better one, and we should just embrace it. So that's it. That should be it. But leave it in the past. And it's a good thing we leave it in the past because it got so tied up. It had to be, and what the work you've been doing is showing how nasty the history became with trying to reinforce this in the modern world, to restore a throne and altar and all of that.
Yeah, the harder the church resisted, the more deranged the reactionaries became. And this is why, and I've made this statement a few times and gotten myself in trouble. My position has always been that the Second Vatican Council came too late.
Yeah,
for a lot of people, the Second Vatican Council gets blamed for the demolition of the faith, and especially in places where it was historically strong, like Austria and Spain and the like. But it was already in decline, and it was in decline because the church had become too closely associated with some pretty bad actors. I mean, if you go to Croatia and you don't see many people at mass, just remember the name the Ustashi and Pavlich, right? These were Catholics that used the Catholic Church as the authority for forced conversions. And integralists will say, well, we're opposed to forced conversions. And the response is, in principle, that makes sense. But that's not how states work. That's not how political institutions work. That's not how incentives work. And that's why, as an ideal, it fails, because it doesn't account for the complicated nature of achieving the ends integralists wish to pursue.
That's right.
And we see this repeatedly. One example that I have raised regularly is King St. Louis IX. And for all of his many religious virtues, he burned all these Talmuds in Paris, managed to put the entire French economy in shambles, and almost died of dysentery after being captured in Cairo. So it's, he may have been a saint, but he was a pretty lousy king.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And the Isabel and Ferdinand as well. I mean,
right. Yeah. That's why my joke when people bring up him has always been that make Louis IX the patron saint of bad rulers. That's probably not going to be a very popular take, but at least it's going to be a more popular take than Dignitatis Humanae came too late, and so did the Second Vatican Council generally. But we should cut
Yeah.
it, man. We've been at this a while. I'm exhausted.
Okay. Yeah, we can. I mean, we'll probably have to respond to some objections and stuff later on, but at least we got like the core elements out of the way here.
Yeah, this doesn't even begin to touch it. And I want to say, I've never said this before, that we really all do owe Thomas Paine a real debt here, because by introducing these questions, he's really deepened, I think, a lot of people's understandings of what happened. I know that's certainly been the case.
Oh, absolutely.
I've read his work multiple times and find it really provocative and really interesting and very serious. And so my hat's off to him. I don't agree with basically anything he's argued, but my goodness, is he is he an original thinker? I really do enjoy his work.
Well, he's helped me understand integralism a whole lot better. My argument against it has evolved because I've had to like take very seriously some of the points that he makes. Now, it's frustrating when you read those debates between him and Rhonheimer, because he says a bunch of interesting things about the history of integralism, but he completely misunderstood what Rhonheimer was trying to say. He thought that Rhonheimer was talking about a natural law state, a state that's not empowered by the indirect power. And that's not what he was talking about a doctrine of the state. The doctrine of the state is a state in the economy of salvation, as, given that the Pope has a real authority and all this other stuff. That's the doctrine of the state that gets changed. But so there was a lot of talking past one another, and it's too bad that it got so heated early on, because we could have had the nice little dialogue there. But I think we've what we're doing here, we're able to draw that out then and extend that conversation, I think.
I couldn't agree more. All right, thank you so much for the rundown today, Tom. This will not be the last we do on this. And we hope that the people who've listened to this were patient with us. We were having a good time today. Wasn't as, as wild as the Judeo-Masonic conspiracy, but that'll be making a return too. So thanks, everyone. And I hope that you enjoyed this. Please, I guess I should do like the classic YouTube ending, right? Please like and subscribe. Don't forget to hit the bell icon. I will. I feel very sheepish saying that's kind of silly, but I'll see you guys next time.
Oh, and next week we got Kevin Vallier on the show.
Oh, Kevin Vallier will be here. He's going to talk about his book. That means I don't have to do much work. I've already read it and I've reviewed it, and you've reviewed it.
He's going to help us set up for you to talk about chapter 2 the week after.
That's right. Second chapter is about modern integrist regimes, ancient and modern, especially modern. When it comes to them, none were good. That should surprise no one at this point. Right. All right, now we're out.
All right, now we're out.
I'm just going to stare until I know it's over.